everyone. I'm Jim Burch. I'm the president of the National Police Foundation, and I'm your host for today's event. I want to welcome everybody to this Facebook live stream event. And for those who are watching this after today on YouTube, thank you very much for taking the time to check out the conversation. Today, we're hosting another conversation in a new series that is designed to reflect our mission at the National Police Foundation, advancing policing through science and innovation. These conversations will almost always feature a scientific or technical finding or an innovation that may help police leaders in guiding and managing the agency, including potentially the development of new policies and procedures. Or maybe they'll help elected officials and community members gain a deeper insight into policing organizations and policing overall. And generally, we want to expand our collective knowledge about policing and public safety in America. Today's event is an initial conversation about reducing police use of force through a training-based intervention. We've heard a lot about policing reforms and various proposals for doing so, some of which are focused on enhanced training. Discussion of reduced police use of force through enhanced or expanded training really isn't anything new. The President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing emphasized the need for de-escalation training. And more recently, various organizations and initiatives have focused on such training as a critical component that's necessary for every department to implement immediately. We thought this would be a great time to have a conversation about our desire, our very, very strong desire as a country and as folks involved in policing to always encourage training to bring about the desired changes that we want to see. Let me be clear about my own views and those of the foundation. Training is absolutely critical. There's no doubt about it, and more and better training are very likely needed. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what do we know about the training being recommended or provided? Does it actually work? Does it matter who delivers the training or how it's delivered? Can we actually train all members in a law enforcement agency in a short period of time, or does it actually take a lot longer and a lot more resources than we think to conduct that type of training? This is a time when research can be helpful in informing our decisions. Today's conversation focuses on the January 2020 American Academy of Political and Social Science, ANNALS, volume 687. The title of that volume is Fatal Police Shootings, Patterns, Policy, and Prevention. And specifically, we're going to be talking about a chapter in the ANNALS of this volume of the ANNALS called Social Interaction Training to Reduce Police Use of Force. That chapter was written by Scott Wolfe, Jeff Rojek, Kyle McLean, and Jeff Alpert. I think you can see on screen a little bit about how to access the journal, or at least what the journal article looks like that we're talking about today. I'm actually joined today by two of the co-authors of this chapter, Associate Professors Scott Wolfe and Jeff Rojek, both from the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, and both of whom have studied policing issues for many years, leading to a variety of published works. Professor Rojek also happens to be a former Los Angeles police officer who will call on today for a bit of the practitioner perspective as well. Gentlemen, I want to welcome you both to the conversation today.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
So let's jump right into the conversation. One of the things that I found about this article when I read it is that a lot of your thoughts here, a lot of what you get into in this article as you talk about training innovation was really came about as a result of an experiment that you all conducted in two different police departments, one in the East and one in the West, where you were assessing the efficacy of a particular training. Can you tell us a little bit about the evaluation and how it sets the context for the rest of the discussion that we'll have today?
Sure, I'll take a shot, and Scott can get me where I missed some key spots probably. So we were working on it's a National Institute of Justice funded study. In short, looking at, can you train to improve the social interaction skills of police officers? And so the program comes out of an organization called Polis Solutions and the program T3, which is actually part of a larger kind of former research effort in DARPA, Department of Research Advanced Projects. There was a 4-year, $40 million project looking at how we improve interactions for soldiers in foreign locations. And so the idea was, can these dynamics that involve police in the development of that program, can you implement a police department and prove its effectiveness? And this is one of the challenges very often with training programs in policing. We often don't have good evaluations that are effective. Now, we're very open to the idea of doing an experimental design. So we picked Tucson and Fayetteville, police, Tucson, Arizona, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and we came up with an experimental design to implement it in its patrol forces, random selection of officers to be in both receive training and the control group not receive the training, and even looking at different dosage levels. Essentially, if we give more training versus a moderate level of training, will we see bigger differences compared to those who receive no training? And then the other dynamic to this is probably, as you're alluding to, understanding the dynamics of implementing training, repetitive training. So there really was kind of three elements. Can we do something with social interaction? Can we run experimental design on dosage levels? And can we look at some of the challenges of implementing training? Scott, did I miss some of those points?
Oh, that's perfect description. Yep.
Great. So let me now just go big picture for a bit and talk about de-escalation. And de-escalation essentially is the well-intended idea that once an interaction has escalated, or if it does, that we can use certain skills and techniques to kind of de-escalate or bring it back down. Jeff, from the perspective of a former officer, did I get that right? Can you tell me sort of how the idea of de-escalation is supposed to work?
Yeah, I think that's right on the point. Where in a sense that you're trying to find ways and mechanisms to interact that avoid a confrontation based on your forms of communication, your exchange with somebody, so that hopefully whatever happens, there's not an action of resistance result in some kind of force encounter.
But I think one of the challenges that we have as we try to understand this is the sort of belief or misperception that these engagements are linear, right? That they're not dynamic in nature and that they don't maybe go up and then back down at various points in the engagement. Can you sort of touch on that?
Scott, you want to jump on that, or would you like me to jump? I'm up.
Yeah. To piggyback off of what Jeff is saying, I think one of the big issues that we see over time with push for more de-escalation training is exactly what you said, Jim. Is this belief that every situation that a police officer gets themselves into or is called to is already at a high emotional or tense state, and that's simply not true. And so one of the issues we have with de-escalation training specifically is that it makes the assumption that is the situation that the officer is encountering, but more importantly, that they are the only individual within that encounter that has a say in the trajectory of it. And that creates further downstream problem of officer buy-in and motivation to take part in that training, because it's sending them the signal that they're the only ones that have anything to do with that trajectory, and takes responsibility off the citizen. And again, we know that's not true, because one of the biggest predictors of what will happen in a citizen encounter with a police officer is the demeanor and behavior of that citizen. So
this in some ways then is more complicated than what people might think. I mean, I think one of my fears is that people believe de-escalation training to be a magic bullet, right? Or a sort of magic solution, that it's this trick or this tool that an officer can use in any situation to kind of bring it back down. And I think one of the things that I really picked up on in the article was this very interesting section where you talk about what's called Deference Exchange. And I'll just read a very brief section from the article and then ask you all to comment on it. So what you're talking about here is a theory that demonstrates that the rules of showing respect and deference during police and citizen encounters are asymmetrical, because officers have legal authority to enforce the law and maintain order. This causes officers to expect deference from citizens, yet not to expect that they must reciprocate the same level of respect to citizens. scholars have observed that officers seek to maintain authority through this asymmetry because it allows them to control a situation, including the ability to question, command, and even physically coerce if necessary. Now that you're talking there about a theory that exists. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a shot at it. So, you think about this. This is embedded in a broader idea of where we have context on social interactions. All of us, when we have interactions, have these kind of, going back to classic social interaction literature, these rituals of how we engage one another, and mutual respect and deference. And in everyday life, those can sometimes not play out. And there's all kinds of rules of engagement, exchange, and who ordering of speaking and forms of communication. When you put it, what Sykes and Clark were talking about when they framed this out there was the idea that an officer enters that situation with some level of legal support, that your job is to go in and intervene in the situation and resolve it to some degree, with even having the authority to use coercive force or restraint of freedom. And so the officer enters in with that knowledge. I have that ability to act in that asymmetrical way with some level of legal authority, assuming it's within boundaries. And the citizen knows that as well, including the citizen that called, knowing I called a police officer with that authority, if assuming it's a call for service. And so that creates an interesting dynamic of where an officer is expected, I have the weight of authority, legal authority to some degree, to come in and address the situation. The challenge can be is that ends up being a situation where I feel I can ask questions and so forth. Some people will agree to that role, some people will not, and that will set up some form of conflict, if you will, or disagreement at minimum at the basic stage.
Yeah, and then I think that kind of takes you to the next point that you make in the article around what Alpert and Dunham have called authority maintenance theory, essentially where the officer's goals of investigation are blocked, or where a citizen or community member's goals of not receiving a citation or not going to jail, those goals may be blocked, and that sets up the conflict, right?
Yeah, I would, I think what you really like about Alpert and Dunham's work is it's an extension, right? In the sense that, yes, officers entering as a result in that position of authority with some goals that I was called here, or I have the authority to intervene to investigate what's going on and to question and so forth. That citizens, maybe their earlier work didn't recognize, that citizen has a goal and agency as well, and they may, at a minimum level, I want to be treated with respect when I interact with officers. But you think of the more extreme, maybe the individual has committed a criminal act and doesn't want to be there at all. So I have no desire to enter into this exchange with you. And so you end up having these kind of competing goals, if you will, and the extent to which each party is not getting their goal achieved ratchets up the tension and potentially to a force encounter, whether it be the officer engaging in some level of force, and this is at the extreme end of physically controlling or so forth a citizen, and the citizen, on the other hand, not wanting to, particularly if they're on the more extreme end and they want to escape, they've committed a crime, whatever, they're going to resist that control. So we start seeing these patterns or these potential trajectories based on these competing goals that may lead to escalation of force, but at the same time, highlights in some cases, because again, we frame this that officers don't have total control, and once you look at it this way, at least opportunities maybe for officers, if they present themselves, to de-escalate away from force. But that takes a receptive body to those de-escalation techniques.
Yeah. Scott, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would add that's interesting is deference exchange and authority maintenance theory have evolved over time, and now we're in our world to evaluating police training and understanding the dynamics of citizen encounters and how that plays into training. We also have other veins of research that come into play. And in particular, something that a lot of us are familiar with is procedural justice. And procedural justice, especially procedural justice training, kind of maps well onto some of those issues that Alpert and Dunham talk about in authority maintenance of ensuring that respect and dignity are something that are part of the tool belt that can be used during that broader interaction to ensure that either maybe you can use that as a tool to not allow a situation to get out of hand, or if it isn't in a high tense situation, you can use to de-escalate.
Yeah. And that actually brings me to, I think, the next sort of topic that I want to get into. But before I do that, Jeff, we're getting a little bit of feedback from Scott, from your side. Maybe turn down your speakers just a little bit or mute when you're not speaking.
Okay.
So what Scott was just talking about was this idea that that we all have these sort of social skills, right, that we can apply in various ways to help steer and guide the conversation so that it's constructive and beneficial to both sides. He talked about it in the context of procedural justice, I think, which is a related concept. But this is something I wanted to dive into with you guys, is a little bit of what you mean by social interaction approaches, and what are the goals and the methods of the training that focuses on social interaction specifically. I mean, what does that mean, and how does that get explained?
Jeff, if you want me to,
Scott, you want to start? And
so I think specifically with the T3 program as one version or one type of social interaction based training, it attempts to get more focused on the wide variety of situations that an officer could encounter during interactions. So as opposed to focusing on only de-escalation skills, it focuses on what I just mentioned, procedural justice skills, those types of communication techniques that can help, but also other things that come into play when you're interacting with a citizen that are necessary to achieve a favorable outcome, like having a high level of emotional intelligence, being self-controlled during those situations. The social interaction training broadly will focus on the diversity of those skills to give officers more tools at their disposal and more experience in the training room that they can take and apply hopefully on the street when they encounter the many situations that they come across.
Jeff, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that, and I think it fits with what Scott's talking about, and we think alike. Obviously, we worked on this project, but when you think about de-escalation skills, procedural justice, a variety of other things we're talking about, self-control, they all fit under that umbrella of aspects that come into a social interaction. And then it's beyond these things, we're starting to think about situational cue recognition, being able to determine and size up what's going on, reading a situation, effective decision making. And so when we start thinking about, instead of focusing on one tool, which may be procedural justice techniques or de-escalation, you're thinking about it more holistically, because the officer has to enter into a situation where they have to read it, they have to constantly evaluate it, make decisions on how to respond, and I can pull these tools. And I think one of the things to think about, it's not just a de-escalation and procedural justice, but there may be cases for tactics and for certain force techniques. And we're trying to build the idea in a social interaction, trying to build a more complex decision maker that understands which comes into play and when it's appropriate in the most effective way. So we're not just one-off technique training, we're trying to integrate it kind of more holistically.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And I will tell you guys, we're already starting to get some questions from the audience, so we'll be able to flip to those here in just a couple of minutes. But I wanted to also ask you about something else you talk about in the article, because this was another key feature of the training you evaluated, but it was also an aspect of what you all talk about as a necessary piece of effective training, particularly for law enforcement, and that's this idea of deliberate practice, repetitive approach. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain how that should be implemented or used?
Sure, I could start this one, Scott. And
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So the concept here is, I mean, if you look at training, police training, you're always under limited frameworks, limited opportunity. You have basic academy training, and then you obviously go, hopefully most programs go into some FTO framework. But some of the prior research, when you look at the work on expertise development, and expertise can correlate with experience, but it's experience in and own is not sufficient. And now those people develop effective skill sets to engage in certain tasks. And this comes out of the body of work on expert performance. Anders Ericsson, if people know his work, and unfortunately, if anybody know, Anders Ericsson actually passed away this past week. phenomenal research on the idea of expert development and what it takes to become an expert. And so the idea is that if you get basic level of training at a short period of time, you can get people to sufficient performance. But when you look at folks, and what we sometimes demand of police is almost expert level performance and reducing error occurrences. And this body of work looks at individuals in medicine, athletics, and peak performers, and makes the case that you have these kind of different levels that you have to do to build repetitive skill sets, and they call it deliberate practice. And the idea is that you're going to train, you're going to give someone instruction on how to engage in a task. You're going to give them feedback when they engage in a task, and you're going to give repetitive opportunities to develop that skill to accomplish that task. And that's the core of what deliberate practice is. And so when we think about police training, the idea that we would show up to a 1 hour course, a 1 day course, or a 2 day course, and that's it, and we expect the police to have a skill set, that's pretty limited. And so how do we build training that maybe has repetitive opportunities for engaging in a task and getting feedback on it? Scott, is there anything else to throw on there?
Yeah, I'd like to add, to put it in today's terms, obviously Jeff and I residing in Michigan as our home state or home base. One thing our state's doing, and I'm alone, is the Michigan legislature is pushing forward with requiring implicit bias training and some form of de-escalation training for all police officers. And I think the intention, it's a well-intentioned move. The problem is, as Jeff is talking about, is most implicit bias training, and in fact, most de-escalation training programs, especially offered by trainers that are outside of agencies, are 1 or 2 days. And those, for one, there's no evidence that, especially from an implicit bias training standpoint, that those programs produce good outcomes for the police. But the bigger issue is that we're caught in this cycle in police training in particular, for a lot of reasons that we can talk about, of not getting to the point where we're able to have sufficiently long trainings to provide that deliberate practice, that repetition. And as Jeff mentioned there at the end of his comments, it's finding the trick is finding the types of training that are not taxing on the operational tempo of police agencies, but also provide some type of opportunity for repetition. And that's the trick.
Yeah, and that's actually where I wanted to go next with you all, is on some of the logistical implications that you all found. If you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think you all talk about it in the context of how hard it is to cycle through an entire agency with a particular training program, but there are a lot of other logistical considerations that we also have to think about. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Jeff, you want me to go first?
Scott, you want to?
Yeah. So going back and forth. So one thing I'd start off, Jim, is a good question, is, social interaction training is not necessarily new in policing. And a lot of folks may be sitting here wondering how, our discussion is different, and especially a lot of agencies that have been progressive in finding new ways to train their officers throughout the past couple of decades have gone to reality-based scenario training, right? In-person scenarios. And those are good, but limited to the extent that they really interrupt operational tempo, at least of portions of your agency, because almost always those trainings have to take place at your academy, right? And so you have to take at least a small portion of officers off the street. And that gets back to our issue of not only taking them off the street, taking them to a training academy, but then you don't have time then to do, repetition. And so that's one of the things that you have to deal with in finding those strategies. And so finding techniques, and I think that's where at least Polis Solutions, who we worked with in evaluating their training, kind of went in a different direction of, well, how do we develop those same types of skills that we're trying to leverage in those types of environments, but in a much more efficient manner, where we can provide repetition and it doesn't take officers off the streets for long periods of time.
And Jeff, as I know from some of our work on other projects together, and from your past experience in law enforcement, if you could just talk about sort of for those who are watching today that aren't in law enforcement, what's the challenge? Why is it so hard to just pull officers in for training? Could you talk about that in the context of minimum staffing and those sort of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think to think about is we don't build police departments because of cost to have slack resources, in essence, right? We have X number of officers to fill certain slotted shifts and need what they define as minimum coverage. It's not like, and again, we're thinking about deliberate practice, right? And we're talking repetitive practice and expert performance. Think of something like we see others, comparative areas. Say in the military, we have forward-leaning entities, and then you pull them offline for rest, training. Think about, again, expert performance athletics. You have events, but then you have periods of training. Law enforcement is always on front line. And so the challenge becomes, Jim, you and I have worked on it. We worked on projects where folks wanted to come in and assume that in 2 days they could get half the agency to show it to a training. And the reality is, I can maybe get you 20% if you have sufficient room, because the rest of the folks are on days off, working in the field and in their rotation. And for me to pull those numbers off, I'm going to reduce the number of officers on the street. So there becomes these logistical challenges of how I get officers to still perform the duties I need them to, but sometimes find sufficient time to pull them away. And I think that becomes difficult because now we have to start finding diversified forms of training delivery. And historically, besides, as Scott points out, I think there's a lot of support behind scenario-based training. The challenge when we move distant is very often some type of distance learning framework, which will be video based on a TV, just kind of watching some static video or PowerPoint online. And we've done some work in others, and there's very low receptivity among officers. And I would say in a lot of workplaces to those. I don't like doing what I have to do for my job. But there are solutions potentially for more interactive forms of distributive learning through video-based decision-making exercises. That in this case, Pulse Solution I developed initially, we did it as a quasi in person. Now it's a fully online framework to utilize that maybe gives that interactive opportunity to distribute it to different geographic locations without pulling people out of the field.
And while you were talking, I was thinking that maybe the closest thing we have today to being able to train as effectively as we're talking about here, and to be able to do it with deliberate practice and repetition, is firearms. Is that accurate or is that unfair?
I mean, I think you'll find across the country there's a wide variation in amount of time the agencies put into firearms training. It's locational resources, funding. I mean, you could argue one aspect of maybe it's not firearms training, but it's requalification. Those can take short period times off, a short period off, while an officer's on duty. It's not going to pay them out of time, but I think you'll find across the country a wide variation based on resources, available trainers, and space and funding to do that even.
Yeah. And Scott, did you find in the study that you all conducted that officers were receptive to the training itself and to the trainers?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was one of the key things that we were interested in over and above, whether it impacted officer attitudes and behaviors, is were they receptive to it? Because we know from other domains that employee receptivity to a training program is a big predictor of whether that training is going to be effective, regardless of the quality of the training. So in this case, the format was something that they were particularly receptive to. And so the format that we haven't touched on much, but the essence of the training was every 2 weeks, officers that were assigned to the experimental condition, the training condition, would, for about 45 minutes to an hour in their roll call, after roll call happened, they would stay back and they would have a T3 trainer that was, part of their agency. They would go through these exercises, and usually they were videos of body cams, cell phone cams, sometimes dash cam, and have a discussion during stopping points throughout those videos, right? And so one thing from a research standpoint that we were interested in is this kind of a novel approach to police training. Let's put them in a training room and have them watch videos, YouTube videos. And so not to say we were skeptical, we didn't know if just basically the police would be receptive to it. And they were very receptive to it. They liked that idea. And the reason they were receptive to it is, for one, it wasn't video of their own agencies and their colleagues, right? So it allowed some distance and a little bit more of an ability for them to be comfortable Monday morning quarterbacking. And also in our interviews with some of these officers, one of the things concerning receptivity goes back to this scenario, reality-based scenario training, is a lot of officers mentioned that, well, in our agency, we're doing that. We're going to the training academy and we're doing these in-person scenarios to act out things that we might encounter. But the problem with those is we usually know what the outcome the trainers want us to achieve, right? It's usually a shoot, don't shoot scenario, or it's a tase, don't tase. And so the actor comes out in a taser suit. And so you kind of know what's going to be expected. And so in a really interesting development in our findings was that the officers were really receptive to watching videos and learning from those videos because there were real cops interacting with real citizens.
Yeah, so keep going on that for a minute, because one of the things you talked about in the article is how it really does matter who the instructor is, right? Their experience and their expertise is sort of sized up immediately.
Absolutely, and Jeff will have, I'm sure, some more insight, especially from Tucson, that he handled. One of the problems we see with a lot of training, especially when it's from an outside firm of experts, is that, and this is probably not particular to policing, none of us in any employee situation are particularly fond of somebody outside of our organization coming in and telling us how to do things, right? And that's really particular within policing as well, or seen in policing, because that outside trainer doesn't know your jurisdiction, they don't know what your problems are, etc. And so one of the keys to receptivity that we found is that those trainers that are providing the training, it's really beneficial if you have a mechanism to have that training be done in-house, right? And that doesn't mean that you can't go to and hire products or hire consultants from outside, but a train the trainer model was particularly beneficial in our case in setting the stage for officers being receptive to the program. Because over time, right, we did the training evaluation for up to 7 months. And so these officers had a lot of time to get familiar with their trainers. And quickly, within the matter of a month, I think the first couple sessions, it became normal to them to take part in the trainings, and they didn't see it as an outside entity anymore, right? Mm-hmm. Against that outside entity, but they wanted it in-house. And that, I think, at least with the officers we talked to, was really important for the receptivity.
Jeff, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I think the other thing you have to add, and just part of it in that aspect, is the legitimacy of the trainer, even in-house. It's somebody that has to have some level of respect on one hand, because if you put someone who's very young in an agency and they have a lot of experience and you're putting them in a room where someone's got 15, 20 years experience of handling a lot of situations, the idea that the person is relatively new is going to have something to say and experience to show becomes very difficult. So you need well-skilled individuals that are respected to carry training. On top of that, you need people who have buy-in, right? So it's one thing you have a well-skilled trainer, whatever the thing you're focusing on, but that personnel has to buy into that training, because you can see essentially a lack of a better term, an othering that goes on, whether we'd see trainers who are giving experiences about the situation and the decision-making and sharing with their kind of examples from their experience and work, or some who will say, well, they said this, referring to the training as it's just something that I don't believe in, but the training says we're supposed to say it. So, some level of respect, credibility in the trainer that you select, and as well as making sure they have buy-in to. And again, in this case, it's social interaction, but this could be in a variety of contexts.
Yeah. And I want to encourage those who are watching today to send in your questions. We've got a couple of them that have been sent in already, but if you have other questions for either of our guests, please send those in now, and we'll be moving to those in just a minute. Scott, could you talk a little bit about the third person effect and how that played in here with officers thinking that they didn't really need this training, but other people might?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up, Jim. So that finding kind of comes out of one of the components of our evaluation. Is we sat down with almost 70 officers between the two agencies, 70 officers and trainers in total, and a lot of the officers were talking about how they enjoyed the training, they thought it was useful, but at the same time, well, I am already doing these things. I'm already being fair. I'm already being self-controlled. I'm already using de-escalation. Or even a step further, our agency does that. And so extrapolated to the entire agency. And so what that is what psychologists refer to as the third person effect. They're seeing some type of value in the programming, in our case, the training, but they don't necessarily think that they need it. They think that others would, right? And it's an interesting way to gauge receptivity, because I think what's interesting when you talk about police social interactions and their skills of working with people, that's a very personal thing. None of us want to admit that we're bad at communicating with people, especially because it's so foundational to what police do. And so I think as part of from like a psychological mechanism where they want to distance themselves from admitting that they need it, right? And some are, indeed, don't make a mistake, are really good at these things, and the training is probably just reinforcing that. But I think the receptivity and the real value comes in them saying, yeah, others would definitely benefit it, not only within my agency, but across the United States. Mm-hmm. Right? I think if they were not receptive to it, if they didn't see any value, right? Officers are blunt; they'll tell you how it is, and they would have told us so, I believe.
So, Jeff, from a former law enforcement perspective, we've talked about receptivity issues. We've talked about logistical issues of getting large numbers of officers through training. In your article, you also talk about the issue of fatigue, right, and some of the things that officers are dealing with as they go through training. So it paints the picture of a really sort of tough audience to deliver training to efficiently and quickly. If you were an administrator today, if you were chief of police or sheriff, and you were given de-escalation training to implement, how quickly would you be able to do it if you had a department of, say, 1,000 sworn officers? I mean, what does that entail?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's the format, right? So if I'm looking at an in-person format that's going to take a day or two, that's going to cycle through 6 months to a year. I mean, in this case, Jim, we've worked with the different agencies are wrestling with these issues. Even in our two agencies in this case, they have in-service training. They have mandatory updating on things like their TRASER qualifications. It takes them 6 months to a year. And these are agencies that are, maybe half that size of 1,000. Mm-hmm. And so it is difficult. And then you start thinking about, that's like I'm pulling somebody out for a half day or a full day to do some training, give an operational tempo, keep a minimal staffing. Now think about if I'm trying to do repetition training, and like we were trying to argue here. And I think that's where it really argues that really demand and need for finding new formats of training. Yes, in person and instructional still needed. Yes, you still need scenarios. But if you want that repetition, you're going to have to start finding alternative frameworks for you, augmented reality, video-based decision-making frameworks like we found with Polis's program here that really thinks about how we look at training and through different mechanisms. And at the same time, I would say constantly measure your receptivity, because going to, as we said, traditional online formats, I don't think it's hitting your target of just putting up a PowerPoint or giving some material to them to peruse and check a box. And I think that's the big thing to think about with our training is if we're hopefully in this, we look at something like social interaction, our goal is to improve police performance. And it's not taking an approach that you're doing bad. I mean, across the workplaces, we all have higher and lower levels of performance. It is, how do we create an environment where there's a growth and orientation to always pursuing expert performance or peak performance? And how do we create a training environment that will continue to engage officers to pursue continued high level of performance?
It's interesting, Jeff, hearing you talk about that, because I'm looking at two comments just recently that came in on Facebook from folks watching. They talk about how we really under-resource this in law enforcement. We really under-resource training, and we've commented on that publicly as well recently as it relates to basic training. But within service, it's even worse, right? There's a lot of competition for a very limited amount of time, and a lot of training that has to be sort of crammed in. And I'm not sure that we're really funding it at the level that we need to.
Yeah, I would say that. And it's interesting to me, and I've had this conversation, and I'll kind of analogize it, and maybe it makes sense or not. So, and I'll put it in the context, but both my kids are soccer players, right? So you look at peak performing soccer players, Leo Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, these guys train all the time, and they play in a performance arena where they're the best in the world, and they still make mistakes, right? The peakest performers. And we put officers in situations, and we want expert performance, particularly when it deals with life and death situations, shooting and so forth. And we don't train them anywhere with the consequences that it has. And we don't put anywhere the level that we ask for other expert peak level performance, but we're asking for that expertise level. So, how do we expect that level of performance of anybody consistently if we're not giving that continual support for practice and training and developing skill sets?
Yeah, then you take a topic like somebody just commented, dealing with the mentally ill, right? I mean, that's not a skill set you're born with, right? And so if you don't have if the training is not being invested in and not being provided, I think we've got some tough questions to answer about that, I think. One of the other questions. Go ahead, Jeff.
I think, and I think you're getting to it's thinking about restructuring and resourcing that you're going to support that. Whatever the missions you define for policing, if you are demanding expert performance, you're going to have to support that structure for it.
Yeah, and as people talk about, defunding the police, I'm not trying to start a sort of a political argument here, but if we talk about defunding the police, I think, one of the things we need to think about as cities and counties and others make budget cuts is, cutting something like overtime might feel like you're cutting fat, but I know a lot of agencies use overtime to accomplish training. Isn't that right?
Scott, I'll defer to you here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with you 100% on that. When you hear the discussions of defunding the police, I think they're sometimes short-sighted because they're not getting at the heart of what some legitimate problems in policing are, right? The issues that we're talking about now, right? And I'll be blunt and use the George Floyd example. Lost self-control, right? Among other things, he made a terrible decision because he didn't have the emotional intelligence and self-control to make the right decision over the course of 9 minutes, right? That could be caused by a number of things, but certainly we could look at as a training gap in that of how to not take a slight from the disrespect of a citizen, going back to deference exchange and authority maintenance, not to take that personally, and how to recoup that lost control in an effective manner.
Yeah,
that's largely a training issue.
Yeah. There was a comment earlier when you all were talking. I don't remember whether it was Jeff or whether it was Scott, but one of you commented that the outcome of a police-citizen encounter is more dependent on the actions of the civilian being encountered. Did you mean it that way, or is that based on research, or should we clarify that?
Yeah, no, yeah, we can clarify that. I think it's equally important as the officer's actions, right? The officer has definitely a lot to say in that encounter. But going back to the comment I made, just to clarify, one of the issues that we can have with some de-escalation training programs, when we focus on de-escalation skill development, is that it's giving the impression to those officers that are being given that training, and in some cases forced to take that training, that you're communicating to those officers that they're the only ones that need the skills to de-escalate, right? And the point that I tried to make earlier is that that's not necessarily true. They do have a big role in it, of course. We wouldn't be talking about training if they didn't, but the citizen does have a say. And so, and this goes back to the reason that's important to have that conversation of the reality of the training and how officers perceive it is this receptivity angle, right? If they're being like, you know, if the Michigan legislator in our case forces officers into a training room by an outside vendor that's offering de-escalation training, that's communicating to them that they don't know how to do their job. They don't know how to effectively de-escalate, and it's their problem, right? Any of us in that situation wouldn't be really receptive to what that message is, because that person doesn't know who we are or what we do in a job, right? And so police wouldn't be any different. And they might need to be, some officers need to be told that because they're terrible at it, right? And some don't. The issue is receptivity. If you want effective training, you have to get that buy-in from the officers to begin with, or you're doomed to fail from the start.
And speaking of de-escalation training, let me just touch on this. Do we know of any de-escalation training that has been demonstrated through research to be effective?
No. Not yet. There's a number, and Robin Engel has actually done research with some of her colleagues on this. And as surprising as it sounds, her research suggests that there's no rigorous training programs out there specifically for police officers. There's de-escalation in other work contexts, but with respect to policing, there's not a sound evidence base of what types of de-escalation would work and why they don't work.
Yeah. And when you were speaking a minute ago, Scott, you talked about how, you know, we're sort of the training for the police and de-escalation, but and one of our viewers said, well, that sort of implies that there should be training for the community on how to de-escalate with the police, but that doesn't seem very practical, right? I mean, it's really incumbent upon us to invest more on the police side to train police to deal with these different types of encounters. Would you agree, or is there clarification needed?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you, Jim. But it probably wouldn't be feasible to have that type of training. The larger point I think, you know, that I was trying to make earlier is that when you're talking about training police officers, you got to be real with them and understand their position as well, right? And tell them that they're the only ones that matter in the encounter, and the citizen has no responsibilities. Not a good starting place, right? But at the same time, they're the professional and they're the representative of the government, and they hold the power, right, of use of force, coercion, and you know, they can deprive liberty. And so they need to understand that power that they have. At the same time as we're not putting all of the burden on you, but here is a wide skill set that you can take into your job that's going to be really, really hard, that you can use to the best of your ability to interact with that member of the public, to understand their position. You don't have to agree with them, but you have to empathize, right? And understand where they're coming from, because you're using that as leverage to get the outcome as an officer that you want, right? You want your outcome as respectful and as fair as you can. You want to guide that situation in the manner that you can, and understanding broad social interaction skills, whether they be procedural justice, de-escalation, maintaining self-control, whatever it is, are all skill sets that can help that officer shape the situation in the direction it needs to go.
Another interesting comment just came in. It said, you know, if officers are not receptive to training, then we've recruited the wrong people. But I know, Jeff, you and I talked a little bit before we came on today about how this is a problem that's encountered in a lot of different professions, right? Or a lot of different groups. This isn't, the issue of receptivity is not something that's unique to police, right? It's a general sort of training question or issue.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think, you know, why we like, for example, social interaction, and you look at Deference Exchange, it fits in a broader model of social interaction that occurs in daily environments in so many different contexts, where these things don't turn out either. They don't turn out right in other workplaces. And you find the exact same thing. And I find it in the university where people are not receptive to training or ideas. You find it in every single workplace. So on one hand, you can go, yes, they're not receptive, but let me know how you solve that, because that problem is probably ubiquitous in every other training environment. So it's a reality and a challenge you have to deal with. And there's some frameworks, and Scott in particular, I mean, I'll give this. We're all part of the research project. The products come out of this. But Scott took a lead on one of our recent publications as well that looks at some of these issues, that looks at some of the drivers on receptivity that you can potentially change. Not just hiring the right person, which is an aspect, but it's also about how the organization is run and managed. And I'll kind of turn over to Scott because he can share it a little bit better.
Yeah, we're thinking exactly the same, Jeff. That's what I want to touch on is, individual characteristics. Probably that's a good point, right? The hiring and selection process matters. You want to pick the right people that are going to be receptive. That's probably kind of hard to select on. One of the biggest drivers we found in officer receptivity to training broadly is organizational justice. The level of organizational justice that officers perceive from their supervisors. So that internal justice. We always talk about procedural justice of how officers interact with members of the public. Equally as important is how fairly they feel like they're treated by their supervisors. Officers that feel like they have been given a voice, maybe a voice in expressing their concerns about a training program, or been given an opportunity to provide feedback on training to supervisors. Officers that feel like supervisors have clearly explained to them why this training is necessary, why it might be beneficial, are those officers that are significantly more likely to be receptive to the training. And then conveniently, those are the same officers that have the biggest attitudinal change as a result of going through the training program.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit, Scott, about the commitment of the trainer or the perceived commitment of the trainer? You talked about this in the article. I think that's an important piece too.
The perceived commitment from the trainer that's actually providing the in-house training, you mean, Jim?
Yeah, exactly. That would something you mentioned in the article is an important piece.
So and I think it kind of plays into some ways that my previous comment about organizational justice. A lot of the trainers in both the agencies we did the evaluation were in some way a superior to a lot of individuals that are in the room. And so the officers that are being trained are already looking up to that person as a superior, somebody they respect, whether because they really respect them or they outrank them. The commitment on the part of that trainer goes a long way, right? And that goes back all the way to their experience in the train the trainer model, right? Mm-hmm. If they had a good experience and they understood why they were being asked to go through this training and to learn how to become a trainer, right? That goes into their commitment in the training room, right? We talked to officers that had experiences with trainers where, and Jeff alluded to this earlier, of where they're kind of more or less some of the, you see trainers that would just go through the motions sometimes, and they're not committed. They would make comments like, well, the program says you should do this. Well, that implies that I don't agree with it. And I'm just going through the motions and I'm just doing my job. The extent to which you can get those officers to be fully bought in, not in a legitimate way, right? They have to fully understand the program and why it's important, and why you have to move forward with it. That will set the stage for the receptivity in their training room.
So that's a pretty long list, right? We've got the quality of the training matters. The commitment of the organization to the training matters. The commitment of the trainers and their ability to present the material matters. The ability of the officers to receive the messaging matters. And then whether or not the message is the right message or an effective message also matters, right? And I think, we've seen a lot of comments, discussion about, how these challenges may or may not exist in other sectors, or that the risks of failed training may not be the same in other sectors. But I imagine that folks who train airline pilots, folks who train doctors, folks who train people in the military, for example, probably experience some of the same issues. Is that off base?
And I won't speak from the perspective of knowing the training in those areas. I think I would be surprised if someone doesn't look critically at those locations and do not find problematic issues. But I mean, even, again, there's plenty written about mistakes and errors and fatalities as a result of medical mistakes. It's not unique to policing. And again, I think one of the things you have to put in context is perhaps it's different and it's very difficult, is the very unique form or aspect of police. We live in an individual rights democracy, where we believe in limited government to some degree, and particularly intrusion in our lives through coercion. And police occupy this very weird space where we're asking them to intervene at the request of other citizens or other reasons. And so you're in this position where you are going to be in a very controversial area, and mistakes are going to happen. And so our goal is to reduce as many mistakes as possible, but you're dealing with human individuals in critical situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Scott, did you want to comment?
Yeah, and I would say beyond that is the reality is there is a problem of a lack of training culture in policing, right? And that's a historical problem, largely because of a lot of logistic issues that we talked about. But to change that, right? Moving forward, we need to find ways of how to ingrain training more into the mindset of an officer, right? In some situations, and you have to provide the foundation and the infrastructure to do so, right? And so the last thing we should probably be talking about right now is taking indiscriminately money away from police. If we want to change the way that we are policing and have more professional policing, right? It's probably a discussion of allocation of budgets, but with much more reality focused on the types of training that we could have our officers engage in and create that infrastructure. It's not going to be a light switch overnight, but we'll change things gradually over time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one of our viewers, David Lambert, just commented on the importance of developing and maintaining true learning organizations. Right? I mean, this is what evidence-based policing is really supposed to be about. When Larry Sherman, first talked about this in many years ago in one of our publications, he talked about the importance of us having learning organizations. So I really appreciate your time today. We're going to go ahead and start wrapping things up now. This has been a great conversation, and I hope we've all learned something from it and from the work that you both have led. Our goal for today was to actively bring research into the conversation and apply it to everyday management and reform conversations. And I think we've done just that. I hope everyone will join us for future conversations on July 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have Robin Engel, who also contributed to the same volume of the Annals. The title of her chapter is Moving Beyond Best Practice, Experiences in Police Reform, and a Call for Evidence to Reduce Officer-Involved Shootings. This conversation has been recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube later in the week so that you can watch it again or share it for those who may have missed it. In closing, I want to thank both of my guests for their time today and for helping to bring research to life. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Great. And thanks, everybody. We hope to see you again on a future episode, a live stream episode from the Police Foundation. Have a great day.